Welcome to the Young Widow podcast, and thank you for joining me for episode 4, The Widow Label. I'm Britany, your host, and I'm happy that you could join me today. This week, we're going to talk about the term widow, what it means, how it feels from a personal perspective. What you're going to get out of this episode is an understanding of the origination of the term widow, the societal view and systemic way that we're taught to think about the term widow, and we're going to talk about how predominant the term is today for the younger generation, but then also how rare it is in our demographical population. We're going to discuss a personal view and talk about what it really feels like to be called a widow. And then we're going to have a small discussion on why you shouldn't let a label define you. Let's start with the origination of the term. Widow originated in the 16th century. It's an Indo-European word, and it stands for be empty. Imagine that. A word that stands for be empty after you lost a spouse. In the 16th century, it was actually normal for the term widow to be used as a prefix. Today, if somebody was a widow, we would address them with Miss. In my instance, it would be Miss Rivera. If I lived in the 16th and 17th century, I actually would have been addressed as Widow Rivera. Now, widow is a pretty harsh term, which we're going to get into, but imagine being addressed to people in society as a widow every time you're introduced. That label bringing pain and tragedy and suffering, and then feeling the pity from people looking at you. Why this is important to this podcast is because this actually goes into the societal view of how we view widows and why we view widows the way we do. The way we view widow and the term of it comes from a systemic way in which we're raised and influenced by the media. From the time we're kids, we have a narrow view of the word widow. We naturally, if you close your eyes and think of the word widow, think of somebody older in age. Books and movies paint pictures in our heads of older women that have lived the entirety of their lives with one person, dressed in black, gray hair, and a veil with wrinkles on their face. But this isn't true, right? A widow technically doesn't have to be old. A widow can be anybody in age. The only rules to being a widow is that you have had to have loved somebody enough to marry them, and then they must have died. It is not confined or constrained by age. I actually want to use some statistics to put some perspective behind it. I am a young widow. This is the Young Widow podcast, and I just want to kind of show how rare it can be. The median age of a widow in the United States is 59 years old. It's actually the same pre and post COVID. The average age of a male widow is over 65. Of the population in the United States, which is over 341 million from the latest census data, there are only 11 million widows out of that 341 million. Of that 11 million, less than 800,000 of those are widows under the age of 45, let alone under the age of 40, and then under the age of 35. I was widowed at 31. If you run the statistics of that, I am less than 7% of the widowed population, and I am less than 0.0002% of the population in the United States. It is rare to be a young widow. There is not a plethora of us walking around. And because it is rare to be a young widow, that also affects the systemic way we think about widows. I never imagined being a widow. I was married. I had a husband. I knew one day one of us would die, but I just never imagined being a widow. And then for it to happen in my 30s, I really felt out of place. I felt secluded, and I felt like I was alone. So if you're a young widow listening to this podcast, that is likely why you probably feel the same way, because you are less than 0.002% of even the widowed population. There are only tens of thousands of us across the whole United States. Being a young widow, we've established that we are not the norm. We are a very small group of individuals within the population. When people see us walking down the street, they don't see us and think, oh, she's probably a widow. Instead, they think, she's a youthful woman in her 30s. If she's not married, then she's probably divorced, or she hasn't even settled down and been married yet. Needless to say, they don't even know that we've suffered already the greatest tragedy in our lives that they hopefully will not have to suffer until later on. So let's get to the meat and potatoes of this discussion, which is what it feels like to be called a widow. The term widow is harsh in its meaning. It's dark, it's lonely, it's black, it's sad. It's a word that's filled with emotions. When you hear the word widow, you immediately think of tragedy and grief. Images of funerals and people dressed in black come to your head. But you can't imagine what it feels like to be called a widow until you are, and it feels like a label that will define you for the rest of your life. I became a widow a mere 13 years after becoming a legal adult and 28 years before the average woman. I, again, felt like a complete outsider, and then I felt like that label was going to define me for the rest of my life. I kid you not, in my early stages of grief, when my husband died, I believe it was probably 2 or 3 days after he died. I can actually remember the moment laying in bed and doing it. I got on Google and I Googled, do I have to call myself a widow? Because I didn't want to call myself a widow. I didn't want people to define me as a widow. I didn't want to be labeled with something that I felt like I didn't resonate with. Widowhood does crazy things to you. And if you're a widow, you know this. And it's actually normal based off of the widows I talk to and other widows to Google random things like, do I have to call myself a widow? Because I didn't want to. And why didn't I want to? Because I couldn't believe it. Because the word felt almost disgusting to me. It felt miserable and sad. And I didn't want that to be the definition of my life moving forward. Lo and behold, that feeling of misery and grief and sadness would actually be the slew of emotions that I would experience in my active grieving phase. And I didn't know how much that word being referenced throughout my active grieving phase would actually trigger me into spells of grief and sadness. To kind of put it in perspective for you, I actually want to tell you this small story. So when I was going through my early days in grief, I had to re-register my husband's truck in my name. In order to do that, I had to go to the DMV, and I didn't think anything about it. So I had his death certificate. Everything was in my little death folder, packaged up, and I was going to the DMV. When I got there, I told the lady that I needed to re-register a vehicle in my name. She didn't ask any questions. She said, here's a document that you need to fill out. Well, when she sent me that document and I started filling out, my brain still hadn't identified itself as a widow yet. And I checked the box married. And as soon as I did that, I quickly crossed it out and then checked the box widowed. And then I froze. And in that moment when I froze, it felt like I was sitting there for minutes, just staring at a piece of paper. And I just started crying. This was actually the first moment that I had ever legally identified myself as a widow. And I had messed up this piece of paper. I couldn't believe that I had to actually check that I was a widow. And I just looked up at the lady and I said, I don't want to be called a widow. Tears running down my face. I'm trying not to cry right now. And she was actually crying too. And she was older in age. And she had said, none of us ever do. That was a real moment of realization for me that even though I was a young widow, the older widows still felt the same way, that they too didn't want to be called widows and they didn't want to be labeled that way. I'm trying to control my emotions now because when you go through a grief so strong as becoming a widow, when you talk about it, it actually transports you back to that initial feeling. This happened for months throughout my early grieving or active grieving phase. Doctor paperwork, school paperwork, big form, taxes. I mean, everything that is a form or an application, it asks your marital status. It was like I was being hit in the chest over and over again by a word, by a label, by something that was created by society to define a person who had lost a spouse. And then it turned into a word that a government needs to classify widows for retirements, pensions, and taxes. A societal classification turned into a legal definition. That in itself is another podcast for the legalities of being a widow. It raises my blood pressure in itself, but it felt like my grief was being thrown in my face. Everywhere I turned, I was being forced to say, I am a widow. I am no longer married. But I hadn't even digested my loss yet. I haven't even went through the grieving process, which is very essential for being a widow. But I was mere months into this, and I was already being forced by society to go through the shock and trigger phase. In my time working with widows, speaking with widows, and finding widow groups to be a part of, I have never met a widow that enjoyed being called a widow. It's not a badge of honor. It's not a descriptive term that we pick for ourselves. It is one that is imposed on us by society. It's a classification to our relationship that was, but doesn't exist anymore. But it doesn't define our relationship. It just means that it ended. I think it's obvious that the term widow brings on a lot of grief and pain, as just seen here today in this podcast. But weirdly enough, I use the term widow and it doesn't evoke emotion from me because I am the widow, because I am the person that has experienced the pain. Because if I'm using the term, it is specifically for a purpose. It is not to define my relationship. It's how we connect. It's how you probably found this podcast. It's how you probably found my social media page. The words, I am a widow too, have never brought me closer to anyone in my life, in my grief, than it did when I used it in a group of women. And that group of women I used that sentence with were all widows as well. So they resonated with it. They understood what it meant, and they grasped the pain that that word can bring on somebody. When a widow uses the term, it's usually to say, I am one of you. I am one of the less than 0.002%. I have been to hell and back, and your hell may be different than my hell, but in this, it is the same. I have experienced the depth of your pain because I too am a widow. When I use the word and when another widow uses it, it's not a personality trait. It's for assimilation and validation. Those are not the same. If someone else mentions me as a widow, references me as a widow, or introduces me as a widow, it pisses me off. And if it pisses you off too, that is completely okay. And why? Because they are doing it from a place of definition. You shouldn't define us by our status of our marriage and whether we lost someone or not. It shouldn't be how we are introduced to society, classified on a societal level. Being a widow doesn't define my future. Being a widow doesn't define who I am. Being a widow doesn't mean I can or cannot achieve something. People that don't know me don't need to be introduced to me from the fact that I am a widow. It's not a personality trait. If you're not a widow and you're listening to this, you probably do not have the idea of the amount of pain that you can bring on someone from defining them this way. And this is my recommendation to you that you should never do that to your friends or family. If you are a young widow listening to this, it is okay to clearly define your boundaries with your friends and families in utilizing that term. I firmly suggest that you draw the line and you let them know that's not okay, that that is a line that you do not want them to cross. It's one, for your own mental well-being that you stood up for yourself, which is important in widowhood, but it's also to let them know that they should not just use the societal classification or legal definition to define somebody's personality traits, who they are, or what they're going to accomplish. I think there's a lot of people that really just don't understand how much label widow brings pain on to people. That doesn't mean that you haven't accepted your grief. That doesn't mean that you haven't accepted the loss of your spouse. You determine how you let the label widow define you. In this podcast today, we talked about the origination of the widow label, where it came from, the systemic view in society and why we think that way. We also talked a little bit about the percentage and demographics of widows and why you should draw your lines with people in your personal matrix. If you're a young widow listening to this, if you feel secluded from the world, it's because you are rare. You are less than 1% of the population. And it's hard to find people that are open about grief that are the same age and demographic as you are. I hope you got something out of this episode, even if it was just validation in the way that you feel about the word. And the next week, we're going to talk about the wedding ring. I've got a lot of questions about, do I have to take my ring off? When do I have to take my ring off? What if I don't want to take my ring off? And so I really want to dive into those emotions, break out all of those preconceived notions that you have about the wedding ring, and then really give you some validation in the way that you may be feeling with that as well. So I hope that you enjoyed the Young Widow podcast today, and I will see you next Wednesday for episode 5, The Wedding Ring.